Hi, my name is Talila A. Lewis. I am here this evening, to read one of my own pieces. This is a piece that was published in Truthout.org on August 27, 2019. The editor's title is Trump's Rule Attacking Disabled and Low-Income Migrants Has Violent History, with a headline reading, "The rule uses the same criteria against migrants that was used to keep black people enslaved." I have a number of other titles, but the one I'll share here is Public Charge, the current move to a permanent underclass of migrants has its roots in American enslavement. And now I will begin reading. On August 14th, 2019, the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, published its final public charge rule. This policy would allow the U.S. government to deny permanent residency and visas to people who rely on or who are likely to rely on public benefits for food, housing, and medical assistance. The Trump administration's intent is to substantially reduce the number of people who are eligible for permanent residency and visas by drastically broadening the definition of what makes a person dependent on the government, or what makes them a public charge, end quotes. Some trace the public charge rule back to the 19th and early 20th century anti-Chinese and other immigration laws. However, the first public charge, end quotes, laws emerged some 300 years earlier. 17th century public charge laws established criteria for enslavement, black people, However, the first public charge laws emerged some 300 years earlier. 17th century public charge laws established criteria for enslaved black people to be denied or granted manumission, or freedom granted by one's owner. Dozens of antebellum public charge laws required enslaved people to prove that if freed, they would never become a public charge, or that they would not be likely to become chargeable. The U.S. has a long history of targeting negatively racialized people based on contrived notions of disability, delinquency, in quotes, and dependency, also in quotes. U.S. public charge policies are yet another cruel embodiment of the country's racist, ableist, and classist history and present that must be told. These laws disproportionately harm people who already face compounded oppression, and many of these people are fleeing economic, political, or environmental turmoil caused by the United States government. This section is entitled "A Racist, Ableist, Classist Attack." There are chilling similarities between Trump's public charge rule and dozens of public charge laws that restricted freedom and forced migration and family separation of thousands of black enslaved and formerly enslaved people who were trafficked into, around, and out of British colonies. Myths of American exceptionalism, in quotes, and claims that the United States is a, open quotes, nation of immigrants, close quotes, open parentheses, ignoring black enslaved people and native people, close parentheses, erase the inextricable connections between U.S. past and present. Enslavement and its associated and continuing sins are the manifestation of a uniquely American anti-Black, ableist, capitalist venture. This grotesque enterprise liquidated humans, assigning valuations that reduced human beings down to their ability to produce, excel, and comport themselves in ways that were deemed normatively acceptable by those in positions of power. Following the publication of the proposed public charge rule in October 2018, immigration, disability, and racial and economic rights advocacy groups rallied during a 2-month public comment period to garner hundreds of thousands of public comments objecting to the rule. Nevertheless, the final rule was published with minimal amendment. In its final rule, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, cataloged hundreds of concerns raised by commenters, often to expressly concede that the rule would have a disproportionately discriminatory and damaging effect on at least disabled people, women, domestic violence survivors, lesbian, gay, bi, transgender, and queer communities, elderly people, children, families, negatively racialized people, and low and no income people, among other, open quote, vulnerable populations, close quotes. One paragraph stated, for example, this rule is likely to result in negative consequences for some, open brackets, people who depend on public benefits to meet their needs, close brackets. Negative consequences are inevitable, consequence of more rigorous application of a statutory ground of inadmissibility that is targeted toward people who receive public benefits to meet their basic needs. DHS declines to modify the scope of the rule to accommodate all possible federal and state policies supporting public benefits use by specific vulnerable populations. End quote. On August 14th, 13 states filed a federal lawsuit against the DHS, and another federal suit followed on August 16th, filed by advocacy organizations that focus on racial, economic, and health equity in service of migrant, children, and farm worker communities. The organizations argued that the regulation was, open quotes, motivated by racial bias against non-white immigrants, in violation of the Fifth Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and that the regulation is an, open quotes, unlawful and unconstitutional attack that threatens the life and health of families that are disproportionately, open brackets, negatively racialized, close brackets, close quotes. The rule is also in direct conflict with long-standing federal disability rights laws which prohibit disability-based discrimination in any program or activity of a federal executive branch. Pardon me, I'm going to reread that last sentence. The rule is also in direct conflict with long-standing federal disability rights laws which prohibit disability-based discrimination in any program or activity of a federal executive branch agency. Acting DHS Director Ken Cuccinelli, aware of the tragedies that will stem following the effectuation of this rule, regaled reporters with a particularly common revisionist version of the founding of this nation. This is in quotes. Throughout our history, self-sufficiency has been a core tenet of the American dream. Self-reliance, industriousness, and perseverance laid the foundation of our nation and have defined generations of hard-working immigrants seeking opportunity in the United States ever since, close quotes. Cuccinelli punctuated this take with a note about the history of the public charge rule, stating, in part, open quote, "For over a century, the public charge ground of inadmissibility has been part of our nation's immigration laws. We will promote these long-standing ideals and immigrant success," close quotes. Cuccinelli, like many, refuses to confront the disturbing truth about the blood-stained, open quote, founding and macabre maintenance of this nation. This section is entitled Public Charge Rules, Roots in Slavery and Colonialism. U.S. open quote immigration close quote policy was not established to attend to a moral obligation to welcome diverse people to this land and pursue the American dream, in quotes. Quite the opposite. U.S. immigration policy is part of a protracted socio-political project steeped in settler colonialism that has long sought to expand and protect the white population's settlement and dominance. The Naturalization Act of 1790, the first federal law dealing with naturalization, in quotes, and national citizenship, held that the only, open quote, alien who could apply for naturalization is a, open quote, free white person of good character, close quote, who has occupied this stolen land for at least 2 years. It would take another 80 years for Congress to extend naturalization laws to, quote unquote, aliens of African nativity and descent, close quotes, and 134 years for all Native Americans to be granted citizenship. Immigration laws that ostensibly prioritized family-based immigration, for example, have done so to, open quote, reassure lawmakers who feared the law's other changes would dilute the distinctly European nature of immigration to the United States, close quotes, and to, open quotes, guarantee the continued dominance of European immigration, close quotes. Majority Northern and Western Europeans secured immense wealth through genocide and generational commodification of millions of black people through the maintenance of workforce Pardon me. I'll start that sentence over again. Majority Northern and Western Europeans secured immense wealth through genocide and generational commodification of millions of black people through the maintenance of forced work camps, i.e., plantations, end quotes, close parentheses. These institutions were sustained not through, open quotes, self-reliance, open quotes, industriousness, or perseverance, in parentheses, or of settler colonialists, but through their systematic campaign of theft, trickery, trafficking, and terror. Civil War and Reconstruction professor David W. Blight points out, open quotes, by 1860, there were more millionaires, open parentheses, slaveholders all, close parentheses, living in the lower Mississippi Valley than anywhere else in the United States. In the same year, the nearly 4 million American, open quote, open bracket, enslaved people, close brackets, were worth some $3.5 billion, making them the largest single financial asset in the entire U.S. economy, worth more than all manufacturing and railroads combined, close quotes. Settler colonialists who violently helped themselves to millions of acres of land and black enslaved people's bodies and labors are not, open brackets, close brackets, migrants or migrants, and people indigenous to the Americas and those kidnapped from the African continent also did not, open quote, immigrate to the U.S. I'm going to read that again. Settler colonialists who violently helped themselves to millions of acres of land and black enslaved people's bodies and labor are not immigrants, and people indigenous to the Americas and those kidnapped from the African continent also did not, quote, immigrate to the U.S. Immigration, in quotes, exists because white European settler colonialists committed genocide, forcibly removed millions of indigenous peoples, created borders, and drafted policies to legitimize, formalize, and legalize this violent appropriation. These truths are central to understanding the origin of the public charge, but more importantly, to understanding citizenship, immigration, and the United States, all three in quotes, as fabricated by white people for white economic, social, and political gain. Black people were kidnapped from Africa, trafficked into, around, and out of American colonies and states, and shamelessly and ruthlessly owned by white Europeans as, open quote, chattel, i.e., personal property, sold with animals, furniture, and other inanimate objects for nearly 250 years. Black humans were wholly commodified, branded, beaten, bred, experimented upon, and killed. Enslavers had no consideration for their humanity. Black enslaved people's entire worth was tied up in their economic value to the person who, quote unquote, owned them, and to the colonial, state, and global economic system of the day. However, Black people resisted enslavement in myriad ways. In addition to organizing uprisings, engaging in work stoppages and slowdowns, and coordinating escapes, many attempted to obtain their freedom through legislative manumission, which included, open quote, self-purchase, as well as enslavers or their heirs unilaterally, opening quotes, abandoning title to their property, close quotes. The legal right to manumit enslaved people could be denied or restricted only through legislative action, and up until the abolition of slavery, colonies and states methodically restricted manumission by banning it outright, increasing requirements necessary to prove that they would not become a public charge, mandating public charge bonds and increasing required bond amounts, making additional demands on manumitted people, such as forcing manumitted people to leave the county, state, or country, and developing other laws to control access to and use of manumission laws. Poor laws, in quotes, held taxpayers responsible for supporting, open quote, needy people in the free population, while property laws held enslavers responsible for paying for the basic necessities for the people they enslaved. Many enslavers took advantage of these laws to exploit Black bodies and labor for an entire lifetime or up until the point of disablement, then to abandon title to their property once these Black people could no longer make profit for the enslaver. These Black people were considered disposable, no longer, open quote, worth their upkeep, close quotes. The modern public charge rule was born out of antebellum American public charge laws that strictly limited the population and movement of black people. These laws restricted white enslavers' ability to manumit healthy and self-sufficient, end quote, black people and elderly, sick, or disabled black people. Public charge laws also applied to black people who sought to, open quote, self-purchase their or their loved one's freedom. States required the enslaver or the enslaved to pay public charge bonds to, open quote, ensure that the freed person would not become a public charge, end quotes, and to cover cost of transportation and removal of manumitted people. For instance, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware had laws that required security against public charge on account that, open quote, free Negroes are an idle, slothful people and prove very often a charge to the place where they are, close quotes. States including North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama limited emancipation to cases where meritorious service was cited, while Virginia made meritorious service the sole ground for manumission. Connecticut's 1777 public charge law required that an enslaved person seeking manumission had to be, open quote, able to support himself and be of a good and peaceable life and conversation, close quotes. While South Carolina's 1800 public charge law allowed 5, open quote, impartial freeholders, close quotes, open parentheses, inevitably white men who unconditionally owned real estate and black enslaved people, close parentheses, to decide that the slave was of good character and able to support himself, end quotes. Later on, in 1846, New Jersey required that the, open quote, Negro be of sound mind and capable of earning a livelihood. Public charge bonds paid by the enslaver or the enslaved served as security in situations where government officials determined that, if freed, a black person was, open quote, likely to become a public charge. Many states also required immediate or exigent departure of manumitted people from the colony, state, or country, forcing people to choose between freedom and family, or compelling forcibly manumitted people to separate from their loved ones. Enslavers and the state leveraged these and other laws against, open quote, industrious and, open quote, self-reliant black people who hustled to earn money, because to pay for one family member's freedom meant that family separation would likely result, and earning enough money to purchase one person, much less multiple people, while enslaved, was staggeringly difficult and required many years. Failure to leave within the specified time frame could lead to the revocation of manumission and return to enslavement. Enslavers who applied to manumit a healthy person within a specified age range, open parentheses, ages varied by state, close parentheses. So I'm going to read again without the parentheses. Enslavers who applied to manumit a healthy person within a specified age range who was determined to be able to support herself could be provided a certificate exempting the enslaver from liability should the formerly enslaved person become chargeable. A similar certificate could be issued if the enslaved person was sought to be manumitted for, open quote, meritorious service, with a discretionary possibility of waiver of the deportation requirement of the law. Extensions of time or exemptions to deportation / removal were possible for, open quote, Negroes of extraordinary good conduct and character, close quotes, also for open quotes, slaves freed for merit, close quotes, and open quotes, well-behaved Negroes, close quotes. These laws were regularly tinkered with and used as population, movement, and behavior control mechanisms. Example, promises of manumission were made to compel more vigorous work and discourage rebellion. These laws would have the effect of forcing Black people to deny disabilities and forego necessary supports just to obtain liberation. This section is entitled, "Will Migrants Be Forced to Forfeit Basic Necessities?" Since their inception, public charge mechanisms have been steeped in a distinct class of intersected racism, ableism, and classism of the cruelest magnitude. Like Cuccinelli, government officials, regardless of the century, have advanced the idea that public charge policies are designed to help, protect, care for, or ensure the success of negatively racialized people. While these sound like admirable goals, public charge policies provide cover for other failed policies and practices that have been unjustly borne by those being labeled public charges. Those officials never reveal their complicity in producing the public charge, open quote, the actual cost to taxpayers, close open parentheses and close parentheses. And the public, let me read that sentence again. I'll do it without the parentheses and then with. Those officials never reveal their complicity in producing the public charge and the public charge. Okay, so now I'm going to read it with the parentheses, and it should make a bit more sense. Those officials never reveal their complicity in producing the public charge, the actual cost to the taxpayer, and the open quote public charge, the actual human who is labeled a public charge. Consider the Black enslaved elder, for example. The elder, their ancestors, children, and grandchildren may all have endured back-breaking forced labor and other violence for hundreds of years between them. Now that the elder can no longer keep pace, the enslaver seeks to write the elder off, quotes. The state will classify the elder as an open quote public charge, denigrating his open quote slothfulness, close quotes, and criticizing his open quote pauper, close quote status. But since this elder's birth, property law created by these officials and their ancestors has branded the elder as not human, just property. And slave codes held that as property, the elder could possess nothing and make no contract. Thus, all the elder's time, work, production, life, and family are possessed by the enslaver and his relatives and heirs. The enslaver's brother sits on the legislative committee drafting public charge laws. The elder's story, when narrated by white people, is decontextualized and used as evidence of racist, ableist ideas about Black people, poor people, elderly people, and disabled people. The similarities between antebellum public charge laws and this administration's public charge rule and immigration policies are stark. Among other things, the current public charge rule modifies definitions and adds to the list of programs that can be considered to determine if a migrant will be considered a public charge. Under the previous definition, open quote, likely to become a public charge, applied to those who were likely to become, open quote, primarily dependent on a list of 4 designated state and federal programs for more than half of their income or support: supplemental security income, temporary assistance to needy families, state general relief or general assistance, and Medicaid benefits that cover institutionalization for long-term care. Under the current final rule, the bar for being classified as a quote-unquote public charge would be considerably lowered, in large part because the Trump administration added 5 additional programs that are essential for health, nutrition, or housing needs. That includes non-emergency Medicaid, supplemental nutrition and assistance program, Section 8 housing choice voucher program, Section 8 project-based rental assistance, public housing recipients of support from any of these programs, and public housing. Recipients of support from any of these programs are now eligible to be considered a public charge. After markedly expanding the list of programs that can be considered by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, for short USCIS officers, the rule also changes the definition of public charge to, open quote, an alien who receives one or more public benefits for more than 12 months in the aggregate within any 36-month period, open parentheses, where the recipient of 2 benefits in 1 month counts as 2 months. USCIS officers would also apply the public charge, open quote, totality of the circumstances test to evaluate an applicant's age, health, assets, education, and financial status, with English speaking ability being used as evaluation criteria. The regulation allows the posting of a public charge bond where an applicant needs to assure USCIS that they will not become a public charge, with the minimum possible bond amount being $8,100. In brief, new public charge rule determinations would hinge on past, current, and future potential use of public benefits, all of which would be determined by factors that on their face are at least ableist, classist, and racist. The consequences of this rule will be dire. Communities that already experience compounded oppression will be forced to choose between having access to necessary health, nutrition, housing, and economic support, or having an opportunity for a desirable outcome on immigration residency or status applications. Public charge legislation of the 1600s through 1800s kept Black people locked out of freedom and into enslavement, while this administration's public charge rule uses the same mechanisms and even the same language to keep migrants locked out of security and into scarcity. At their heart, public charge strictures are a cruel reaffirmation of a seemingly everlasting, violent insistence that is emblematic of the United States. Power and capital always trump humanity. This section is entitled, "The U.S. Must Confront Its Past." The erasure of the origin story of the public charge rule, despite hundreds of years of explicitly targeting Black, Indigenous, disabled, low-income, and other marginalized communities, is part of a long tradition of Americans refusing to look at the violent contradictions that hold this country together. This refusal is why so many people who are invited to sit with these contradictions instead claim that those who reveal these truths are trying to tear this country apart. Immigration policy seeks to maintain an exploitable labor pool without running the risk of working class, negatively racialized, disabled, or incarcerated people gaining enough power to successfully challenge the status quo. The goal is to artfully obscure the true adversaries: authoritarianism, capitalism, imperialism, and all forms of oppression. By enacting policies or engaging in practices that quell dissent and sow discord within and across our communities. I'm going to read it without the parentheses. The goal is to artfully obscure the true adversaries by enacting policies or engaging in practices that quell dissent and sow discord within and across our communities. And now I'm going to read it again with the parentheses. The goal is to artfully obscure the true adversaries, open parentheses, authoritarianism, capitalism, imperialism, and all forms of oppression, close parentheses, by enacting policies or engaging in practices that quell dissent and sow discord within and across our communities. U.S. immigration policy legitimates dangerous eugenicist ideas about the inferiority of immigration exclusion targeted groups and the superiority of the drafters of these edicts and their ilk. Importantly, immigration policies inform legal and extrajudicial violence by white supremacists who claim to engage in violence, open quote, in service to the state and or race, close quotes, compounding the discrimination and violence faced and the terror felt by those targeted by immigration policy. The reincarnations and longevity of U.S. public charge regimes and the near complete exclusion of their overtly anti-black ableist, classist configurations are disconcerting and instructive. They exemplify how buried histories will continue to haunt and wreak havoc on our present and future. They demonstrate the nimble, timeless, and comprehensive nature of structural and systemic oppression. Finally, they serve as proof that power holders appreciate how identities intersect, making intentionally intersectional responses to state violence all the more necessary. In this era of authoritarianism, there are concessions we simply cannot make. Demonization of any group that is intentionally made politically, socially, or economically marginalized fans eugenic flames, stokes genocidal tendencies, and emboldens white supremacists. Therefore, advocacy that supports migrants because migrants pay taxes, in quotes, are, open quote, important to the economy, do not have criminal records, in quotes, work long hours for low wages and jobs that Americans won't accept, in quotes, etc., only serve to reify the systems that we should be seeking to dismantle. People everywhere must ardently contest messaging that ties people's value to their labor productivity or that establishes categories of inferiority and superiority of marginalized people. Migrant justice work must be intentionally rooted in anti-ableist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist frameworks. The U.S. is implicated in the deprivation of security to people around the globe, especially indigenous peoples and descendants of the Americas and African continent, those in or around the sites of U.S. wars and conflicts, and those from the global South and U.S. territories. Migration and the provision of public benefits should be supported because migrants are human and deserving of freedom of movement, residence, and security. Further, the United States colonial, imperial, capitalist legacy divests it of moral and legal authority to deny entry to humans seeking security, especially indigenous peoples. There is more than enough wealth in this nation to ensure that everyone is cared for. Impoverishment is a political choice. In the face of a swiftly advancing global neo-Nazi resurgence, it is unwise and unsafe to cling to aspirational symbols of equality and hollow untruths. This nation must confront its past, which in too many ways mirrors our present. To erase parts of American history that are difficult to confront is to acquiesce to white supremacy and invite its flood of injustice and terror to endlessly recur. Demands for migrant justice must uplift the inherent value of all people and be grounded in the historical truths that center Black, indigenous peoples' experiences. Anything less increases opportunities for eugenics, plays into the boorish hands of a demonstrably authoritarian administration, and will result in yet more deaths.